Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to MetrObelisk Radio. Today we are looking into the pilot of Firefly that was written and directed by Joss Whedon. Now everything that needed to be said before we dive into this has been said in the introduction episode of this series, so let's just get right into it. Now before we do that, remember to follow the blog, metrobeliskradio.blogspot.com, to stay updated on all of the uploads on the channel. Now, this episode opens up with the Battle of Serenity Valley. In this world, in the show, there was a civil war between the Alliance, which is big government, against what were known as the Browncoats, which was the independence movement. The Alliance had the central planets of this galaxy and wanted to expand, and the Browncoats fought against that Alliance takeover. Now, during this sequence, this is when we get our first introductions to Malcolm Reynolds and Zoe, and this civil war is going to be referenced later on throughout the series. Now, I brought up in the introduction episode that there was a connection between Firefly and the Alien franchise. This is brought up when Malcolm gets onto the AA gun and shoots down one of the ships at the very end of the sequence. Now, if you pay attention on the targeting computer, the Weyland-Yutani Corporation logo is seen on the upper center part of the screen. Now, I don't write that off as coincidence, and not just because Fox also owned the rights to the Alien franchise, but because Joss Whedon also wrote the screenplay for Alien Resurrection. Then it goes to 6 years later when the Serenity crew is on a job salvaging some Alliance food bars. Now, after this point, you hear the character speak in both English and Mandarin Chinese. Now, according to the lore, at least what I looked up, Firefly takes place in a world where Earth only had two superpower countries left, the US and China. So as a result, the languages merged. Now, me personally, I saw this as a way to say the words goddamn and fuck on television at the time without getting fined by the FCC. Because remember, in the early 2000s, you could not say the words goddamn or son of a bitch. The worst you could say were damn, damn it, and hell. Now we get up to a whole bunch of character introductions, but I'd rather them handle this all right now rather than wait until later on. So, the first that we see is Malcolm, obviously played by Nathan Fillion, who everybody loves, who is the captain of the Serenity, and he's definitely the leader of the pack, but more of an unorthodox leader in the sense that he doesn't play by the rules to get a mission accomplished. Now, next to Malcolm is Zoe, that's played by Gina Torres, basically his right-hand man, someone who was with him during the war and pretty much stuck by his side. Then we see Jane, who was played by Adam Baldwin. Now, he's the bruiser of the group, always ready to go toe-to-toe with anyone who tries to screw with him or his money. The perfect example is when the crew tried to offload the stolen cargo to Badger and basically got told no and no payment. Jane was ready to throw down right then and there. Then we get up to Wash, played by Alan Tudyk, another person everybody loves, who is the pilot of the Serenity, also married to Zoe, but definitely he's more of like the comic relief throughout the show. Then we get Kaylee, played by Jewel Staite, the mechanic on the Serenity, the always happy-go-lucky type. Some people like it, some people like this character type, others it kind of annoys them. I'm in between on that one. Next we get is Inara, played by Morena Baccarin, the companion on the ship. So, what is a companion? Well, translated to English, she's the whore who rents out one of the shuttles on the Serenity, but she's needed to get the Serenity into docking stations because of her line of work, because in this world, brothels are completely legal. Then we get Shepard Book, played by the late Ron Glass. He's the preacher that's just looking for the journey. It's not always about the destination. And we see that in his introduction where he's just carting around his belongings, just looking at the ships, and like I said, not really paying any attention to their destinations. Then we get introduced to Simon, who was played by Sean Marr, first introduced as a doctor, but, unfolds later on in the episode. Then we get Lawrence, who's played by Carlos Jacket, and he's just a passenger on the Serenity. We don't actually learn his name until much later on during this episode. Now, after all those character introductions, the ship departs from the port that they arrive at, and the Serenity crew has to go to Whitefall to sell the stolen goods. They then learn that there's an Alliance mole on their ship, and it's now just a matter of who. Initially, the crew thinks that it's the doctor, Simon, but it turns out to be Lawrence trying to arrest the doctor, and the Alliance tells the Serenity crew to stay on course for prisoner transport. Kaylee then gets shot in the process of hostile negotiation, and the Doctor bargains with the Serenity crew to divert course, or he will basically let her die. The Fed, as they call Lawrence, then gets tied up. Now, Malcolm then wants to know what the Doctor is harboring since it almost got one of his crew killed, which, fair point. And that's when we're introduced to River Tam, the sister of Simon. And River as a character is described as someone with super high intelligence where everything comes to her naturally, like breathing to everybody. She went to an academy where the Alliance was messing with her brain and Simon had to smuggle her out through cryogenic sleep. Now, my biggest issue with River as a character is that this character is a template to become a Mary Sue or / Gary Stu later on in the show. Now, after this, Malcolm just lays it out on the table for Simon that if Kaylee dies, he will blast Simon and his sister out of the airlock, no questions asked. So some time passes, and as a moment of comic relief, Malcolm tells Simon that Kaylee died on the operating table. Simon runs down to the medical station to find her alive and calls Malcolm a psychotic. Now, shortly after this, we're introduced to the Reavers. Now, the Reavers are a race of alien that will, in Zoe's words, severely rape, then kill you, then sew your skin onto their clothes, and if you're very lucky, in that order. Now, the Reavers initially don't attack them. And then, so during this whole thing, Lawrence tries to strike a deal with Jane to turn on Malcolm and to deliver River back to the Alliance. Now, Lawrence, said that he'll get enough money to buy his own ship, one that's better than the Serenity, at least with that offer to Jane. Now, the Serenity then lands on Whitefall to sell the Alliance good to Patience, a woman who previously shot Malcolm. Malcolm, Jane, and Zoe bury the goods until they get the money. Jane goes up to take out a sniper in the valley that they're meeting in. Now, up to this point, he may or may not turn on Malcolm. But back on the Serenity, Lawrence gets loose from his restraints, knocks out Book, and captures River. Simon tries to stomp him, but Lawrence eventually gets River at gunpoint. Now, in the valley with Patience, Malcolm makes the delivery, but almost gets robbed of the money. Jane shoots one of the bodyguards that Patience is with, and it leads to a big shootout in the valley. Now, Malcolm and Zoe do get shot, but are wearing body armor. Malcolm gets the money from Patience and leaves after that. So then Malcolm, Jane, and Zoe get back to the Serenity and find Lawrence holding River at gunpoint. Malcolm, who looks like has already had a bad day, just doesn't hesitate, shoot him right between the eyes, then throw his body off the ship for the buzzards to find. Then the Reavers that they passed earlier have followed them to Whitefall. It leads to this chase in which they ultimately get away. And by the end, Malcolm makes Simon a deal to be a medic on his crew if he can keep his sister under control. Simon accepts as he has no other alternative at this point. So that was the episode in a nutshell, and I'm going to just end this with some final thoughts. Now, I do believe that this episode does drag in some spots. Like, this is early on, but all of the character setups take about 20 to 25 minutes in that port and then on the ship. I believe it could have been shortened down to allow for more plot to happen. Character development is important, but introductions are supposed to be quick. We don't need to know everything right away, especially if it's on a television show where stuff is going to unfold over time. Now, one last thing. River Tam by the end of this episode is set up for two things. The first is the Mary Sue character that's good at everything and bad at nothing, like I mentioned earlier. And the second and more important is that now she's the MacGuffin of the series. She's the reason why the Alliance is chasing down the Serenity. Now, the issue with most MacGuffins is that they lose their importance after the first act. That's why they're called MacGuffins. So now the issue could become, why are River and Simon still in the show? Could they be written out with no consequences later on, going into a second season, or maybe by the end of said second season? But overall, it's good for a pilot episode. It sets up the conflict for the rest of the series, since this was only 14 episodes long. But it sets it up nicely, along with introducing us to all the main characters of the show. Now, that's the end of this episode, folks. I hope you enjoyed our breakdown of the pilot Serenity. I hope that you will join in next time when we look at the second episode of the series, The Train Job.